My name is Irene Caldwell, and I'm 68 years old. I want you to stay with me until the very end of this story because what my nephew did to me and what happened the day I finally walked out of Maplewood Gardens will stay with you long after you've finished listening. Comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I read every single one. I spent 31 years building something real, not flashy, not overnight. Just steady, honest work in commercial real estate across the greater Phoenix area. By the time I turned 65, my portfolio was valued at just over $4 million. 3 rental properties, a small strip mall in Scottsdale that I'd held since 2001, and the house I'd lived in for 22 years on Juniper Ridge Road. A 4-bedroom with a wraparound porch that my late husband, Frank, had helped me pick out the summer before our daughter was born. Frank passed in 2019, pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end, and I still haven't fully made peace with how fast it went. After he was gone, the house felt enormous. My daughter, Carolyn, lived in Portland with her family. We talked every week, but she had her own life, her own children, and I never wanted to be the kind of mother who made her feel guilty for living it. So when my nephew came to me in the spring of 2021 and offered to help, I thought God had sent me something good. His name is Bradley. He's my younger sister Patrice's son. 34 years old, charming the way only certain men are charming, the kind where you don't notice the calculation behind it until it's too late. He just moved back to Arizona after a stretch in Denver that he was vague about. Said he wanted a fresh start, said family mattered. Said he worried about me being out there alone in that big house. I should tell you, I was not a lonely old woman with no sense. I had friends. I had my church group. I had a financial advisor I'd worked with for 11 years. I was sharp. I still am. But grief does something to your defenses that you don't always notice while it's happening, and Bradley knew exactly when to show up. He started small, coming over on Sundays to mow the lawn, fixing the drip in the kitchen faucet that the plumber had quoted me $800 for, bringing groceries, sitting on the porch, and listening to me talk about Frank. He was good at listening, or at pretending to. About 4 months in, he asked if he could rent the guest room. He'd been staying with a friend, he said, and the situation wasn't ideal. He'd pay me. He'd help around the house. It would be good for both of us. I said yes. I told myself it made sense, and maybe in the beginning it did. The woman came into the picture around Thanksgiving. Her name was Krista, mid-30s, beautiful in a way that felt intentional, always laughing at things that weren't quite funny. She started spending weekends at the house, then most of the week, then she just never seemed to leave. I was polite. I wanted to be the kind of aunt who didn't make things difficult, but I started noticing things. Small things first. My reading glasses moved from where I'd left them, mail opened and refolded. Bradley asking questions about my properties, not casual questions, investment-curious questions. How much was the Scottsdale strip mall pulling in per month? Whether the leases were long-term. What I planned to do with everything, eventually. I told myself he was just interested, that he'd grown up and was thinking about his future. I told myself a lot of things that year. In January of 2022, I had a fall. Nothing dramatic. I slipped on black ice on the front walkway on a morning Bradley should have already salted. I fractured my wrist and bruised 2 ribs. It wasn't life-threatening, but it scared me more than I wanted to admit. I was alone when it happened. Bradley and Krista were still asleep inside. That fall became the cornerstone of everything they built against me. Within 2 weeks of my discharge from the hospital, Bradley sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where Frank and I had eaten breakfast for 20 years, and told me he was worried, that the fall had scared him, that he thought I needed more support than he could provide alone. He had a pamphlet. He'd done research, he said. There was a place called Maplewood Gardens in Mesa, assisted living, beautiful grounds, a community of people my age. Just for a little while, he said. Just to get back on my feet. I told him absolutely not. I said I had fractured my wrist, not lost my mind. He nodded. He said, of course. He said he understood completely. 3 weeks later, I got a call from an attorney I'd never heard of, informing me that Bradley had filed a petition for guardianship on the grounds that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. I want you to understand what that sentence actually means. In Arizona, if someone successfully petitions for guardianship over you, they can make decisions about where you live, who you see, and how your money is spent, and you have limited ability to stop it. It's a legal process designed to protect vulnerable adults. And it can be weaponized by exactly the kind of person Bradley turned out to be. He had a doctor. I still don't know how he found her or what he told her. But there was a physician who had met with me exactly once, a routine follow-up after my fall, who submitted a statement suggesting I showed signs of cognitive decline and difficulty with complex decision-making. I had answered every question she asked me. I had been tired that day. I'd been grieving and tired and 67 years old, and apparently that was enough. Here is the part that people always ask about, and I want to address it directly because I've seen the questions. Why didn't I hire a better attorney immediately? The answer is that Bradley had already moved faster than I understood. Before I could act, he filed an emergency motion claiming I was at risk of financial self-harm, that I was making erratic decisions with my assets. The court issued a temporary freeze on my primary accounts while the petition was pending. I had my properties, but the liquid cash I would have used to retain a private attorney was locked. My financial advisor was notified and legally restricted from acting on my behalf during the freeze. I had access to a small personal checking account with less than $2,000 in it. I was a $4 million woman who couldn't write a check for a retainer. The court appointed a public guardian and a legal aid attorney to represent me. My legal aid attorney was a young man named, I'll just say he was young and overwhelmed and doing his best. He believed me, but believing someone and being able to fight a well-prepared petition in time are two different things. Carolyn flew in from Portland the moment I called her. She was furious, a cold, quiet furious that I recognized as the most dangerous version of her anger. She started making calls. She hired an attorney on her own credit card. But the process had momentum by then, and momentum in a courtroom is hard to stop. The hearing lasted 2 days. Bradley sat across from me in a suit I'd never seen him wear, and Krista sat behind him in the gallery, and they both looked so reasonable, so concerned. He testified that he'd watched me forget to pay bills, that I'd left the stove on twice, that I'd seemed confused about dates and appointments. Every single thing he said was either fabricated or twisted so far from context that I barely recognized the events he was describing. My attorney presented what she could in the time she had. Medical records showing my wrist fracture was a result of an unsalted walkway, not deterioration. Statements from my financial advisor confirming 11 years of sound, consistent decision-making. A letter from my pastor. A letter from 2 women in my church group who had known me for 15 years. The judge ruled in Bradley's favor on a provisional basis. 18 months of supervised guardianship, to be reviewed at the end of that period. I was to be relocated to Maplewood Gardens while my situation was assessed. I remember the exact moment I heard those words. I didn't cry. I looked at Bradley and he was looking at his hands, and I thought, you have made the worst mistake of your life, and you don't know it yet. Maplewood Gardens was not a cruel place. I want to be fair about that. The staff were kind. The food was acceptable. There was a sunroom I liked in the mornings. But I was 68 years old, and I had not lost my mind, and I was there because my nephew had decided my property was worth more to him than my freedom. He visited twice a month. The facility required that visits be logged, and every time his name appeared in that log, I declined. Every single time for 18 months, I sent word through the front desk, I'm not available. Not once did I sit across from him and pretend any of this was normal. What Bradley did not know, what no one knew, was what I was doing with my time. I had my phone. I had access to email, and I had Carolyn, who visited every 3 weeks, and who I had instructed carefully in what to look for. From the very beginning, I suspected Bradley's plan wasn't just to place me in guardianship. Guardianship meant he could manage my affairs, but the properties were still mine. To really take them, he'd need to either have me declared permanently incompetent or get me to sign documents while under his legal authority, documents that could be framed as being in my best interest. I was right. 6 months into my stay at Maplewood, Bradley filed paperwork to transfer management authority over the Scottsdale strip mall to an LLC he had formed with Krista 3 weeks after my placement. The stated reason was that the property required active management beyond what the current situation allowed. It was framed as a practical measure. My public guardian, who had a caseload of over 90 clients, signed off on it without fully understanding what he was approving. Carolyn flagged it immediately. We documented it. 3 months later, Bradley attempted to renegotiate the long-term leases on 2 of my rental properties at below-market rates to tenants I'd never heard of. One of those tenants we later discovered was Krista's brother. We documented that too. I had a contact, a woman I'd met through 30 years in commercial real estate, a property attorney named Frances who'd retired but who agreed to consult informally when Carolyn reached out. Frances wasn't representing me in any official capacity, but she was reviewing every document Carolyn brought her, and she was building a timeline. What Frances found over the course of those 18 months was systematic financial exploitation of a protected adult, which, in Arizona, is a Class 4 felony. She found that Bradley had accepted rent payments into his personal account rather than the property trust account. She found the LLC transfer had been executed without proper court authorization, making it legally void. She found email correspondence between Bradley and Krista discussing, in their own words, how to extend the arrangement past the 18-month review. That last one. I want you to let that sink in. He was planning to petition for permanent guardianship. He intended for me to stay in that room at Maplewood Gardens indefinitely. The review hearing was scheduled for the end of August 2023. Carolyn had retained a private elder law attorney by then, a woman with 22 years of experience and a reputation in Maricopa County that Bradley's attorney clearly was not prepared for. She filed a motion to present new evidence 5 days before the hearing. She submitted Frances's complete findings, the documented financial records, the email correspondence, and statements from 3 of my tenants confirming they had been contacted by Bradley about lease changes without any representation that he had legal authority to do so. She also submitted an updated cognitive evaluation conducted by an independent neuropsychologist, not the physician Bradley had used, that found no evidence of cognitive impairment whatsoever. In fact, she noted in her report that my scores were above average for my age group. Above average. For someone Bradley had convinced a court couldn't manage her own affairs. The morning of the hearing, I wore a navy blazer I'd bought specifically for that day. Carolyn drove me. We didn't talk much in the car. She held my hand at a red light somewhere on the I-10, and I looked out the window and thought about Frank, the way I still do at the moments that matter most. In the courtroom, Bradley was still performing. He came in looking the way he always looked, put together, reasonable, the picture of a concerned family member. Krista was in the gallery again. I sat at the plaintiff's table and I did not look at either of them. The judge reviewed the new evidence in a closed pre-hearing session. When proceedings opened, her expression told me everything before she said a word. The guardianship was terminated. Not extended, terminated. With prejudice, meaning Bradley could not file again on the same grounds. The LLC transfer was declared legally void. The court referred the matter to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office for criminal review of the financial exploitation findings. Bradley was arrested 14 weeks later. Krista was charged alongside him. The charges included exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraudulent transfer of real property, and misappropriation of funds held in trust. Their combined bail was set at $250,000. My sister Patrice called me the night after the arrest. She was crying. Not the kind of crying that asks for something, just the raw, bewildered grief of a mother who has come to understand what her child is. I told her I was sorry. I meant it. I know what it is to love someone who does something you cannot defend. I moved back into my house on Juniper Ridge Road on a Thursday in November. The porch was exactly as I'd left it, which surprised me. I'd half expected Bradley to have changed something, but the wicker chairs were there, and the fern I'd been worried about had somehow survived, and I sat outside that first evening until the sun went all the way down and the air turned cool, the way Phoenix nights do in autumn, that sudden desert cool that always feels like a gift. Carolyn stayed for 2 weeks. We cooked. We watched old movies. We didn't talk about it constantly. There would be time for that, and honestly, there are things you process better in quiet than in conversation. I'm back to managing my properties. My financial advisor and I spent 2 months reviewing everything, unwinding what could be unwound and rebuilding the structures that had been disrupted. The Scottsdale Strip Mall is back in the trust where it belongs. The leases are back to market rate. The criminal case is still moving through the courts as I record this. I won't share the details of what I hope the outcome looks like, because what I've learned in 68 years is that wanting justice and demanding a specific form of it are two different things. What I know is that there's a paper record now, a complete, documented, court-verified record of exactly what Bradley did, and that record does not go away. There are things I think about differently now. I think about how quietly it can happen. Not with force, not with threats, but with paperwork and patience and a system that moves slowly enough that by the time you understand what's being done to you, a great deal of it is already done. I think about the adults who don't have a Carolyn, who don't have a Francis, who don't have 30 years of professional relationships to draw on when their world is being quietly taken apart. If you're watching this and you have a parent or a grandparent living alone, I'm not telling you to be suspicious of everyone who tries to help. Most people who help are genuinely helping. But pay attention. Know what your person owns and how it's documented. Have those conversations before there's an emergency, because an emergency is exactly when someone like Bradley is waiting to arrive. And if you are someone like me, if you are sitting somewhere tonight wondering whether what's happening to you is what you think it is, I want you to hear me clearly. You are probably right. Write it down. Date it. Send it to someone you trust outside the situation. Don't warn the person who's doing it. Just document and find one person who can help you get to the right room. The right room exists. I know because I was finally in it. My name is Irene Caldwell. I'm 68 years old. I built what I built, and I still have it. If this story helped you or someone you love, please share it, because I promise you there are people who need to hear it. And leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if this reminded you of someone. I read every word. I've thought a lot about what made Bradley believe he could do what he did. And honestly, I think it was patience. Not the good kind, the calculated kind. He watched me for months before he moved. He waited until grief had softened my edges, until I'd let my guard down enough to call his presence a blessing. That patience was his weapon, and for a while it worked. But here's what I've come to understand. The same qualities that make a person a target, their openness, their willingness to trust, their capacity to love even after loss, are also the qualities that make them capable of surviving what gets done to them. Bradley looked at me and saw vulnerability. What he miscalculated was that vulnerability and weakness are not the same thing. I think about the choices he made, one by one. The doctor's statement, the emergency motion, the LLC he formed with Krista 3 weeks after my placement, as if he'd been drafting the paperwork in his head long before I ever fractured my wrist. Each of those choices compounded the last. Each one created a record. And records, in the end, are what courts run on. He built his case against me with documentation. I built my case against him with the same tool. The difference was that mine was true. There's a version of this story where I don't have Carolyn, where I don't have 30 years of professional relationships that eventually led me to Francis, where I don't have the presence of mind, even inside a room I never chose to be in, to stay methodical instead of just staying angry. I think about that version, and it frightens me, because I know it's not hypothetical. Is the reality for people who don't have those things. And most people don't. What I want to say to anyone watching who is sitting with something similar, whether you're the person it's happening to, or the daughter flying in from Portland, or the retired attorney who picks up the phone because something about the situation feels wrong, is this the clearest thing I learned across those 18 months is that paying attention is not paranoia. Documenting is not drama. Asking questions about someone's finances or legal standing before an emergency is not cold. It is exactly the kind of care that actually protects people. Bradley will face a jury. Whatever they decide, I cannot control. What I can control is what I do with the time and the property and the life I got back. I sit on that porch on Juniper Ridge Road some evenings and I think about Frank and I think about how he always said the house would outlast both of us. He was right about that. He was right about a lot of things. 68 years has taught me that people who take from others quietly, patiently, with paperwork instead of force, are not smarter than their targets. They are just willing to do something that most decent people cannot quite bring themselves to believe someone would do. That disbelief is the gap they move through. Close the gap. Ask the questions. Trust what you're seeing. I'm still here, and so is everything I built.